Right now, sitting somewhere in your home, you probably have a Bible, or you know someone who does. It is the most printed book in the history of the world, more than 5 billion copies, read by kings, carried into battle, placed beside the dying, sworn upon in courtrooms across America. And yet, almost no one ever asks the most important question about it. Not what it says, but who decided what goes inside it. Because here is something that will stop you cold. The Bible you hold today, the one passed down through your family, the one read from pulpits every Sunday morning, it did not always look the way it looks now. There was a time, centuries ago, when there was no single Bible, when early Christians across the ancient world were reading completely different books, books that described Jesus, books that told stories about his disciples, books filled with visions and prophecies, and many of those books are not in your Bible today. So here is the real question, not just what is in the Bible, but who decided, who chose, and who was left out of that conversation entirely. Stay with me, because the answer to that question reaches back almost 2,000 years, and it is far more fascinating than most people ever get to hear. Let us go back to the 1st and 2nd centuries after the life of Jesus. There is no printing press, no internet, no mass communication of any kind. The only way a text survives is if someone copies it by hand, and then someone else copies that copy and passes it along. Now imagine this. Christianity is spreading not from one central place, but in all directions at once, into Egypt, into Syria, into Greece, into Rome, into Ethiopia, into Persia. Each of these communities is growing, each is developing its own understanding of the faith, and each is reading different texts. In Alexandria, Egypt, which was one of the greatest centers of learning in the ancient world, Christians were reading certain writings. In Antioch, in modern-day Syria, a different set of texts was circulating. In Rome, yet another collection entirely. Now here is what most people never realize. There was no agreed-upon list, no official collection, no single authority saying, these books are in, those books are out. Early Christians read what they could find, what had been passed down to them, what their local teachers trusted, and what helped them make sense of their lives. Think about that for a moment. The faith that would eventually shape the entire Western world was, in its earliest centuries, a patchwork, a living, breathing, diverse collection of voices. Does that surprise you? It surprises most people, and it is exactly where this story begins. Here is something that turns the whole story upside down. The problem in the early church was not that there were too few sacred texts, it was that there were too many. Dozens of gospels were circulating, dozens of letters, visions, prophecies, acts of the apostles. There was the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Mary, the Shepherd of Hermas, the Didache, the Epistle of Barnabas, and many more. Some of these texts were widely loved, some were only known in certain regions, some contradicted each other on important points, and this created a serious problem. If you are a Christian leader in the 2nd century, trying to teach your community, trying to hold things together, trying to decide what is true, which books do you trust? Which ones speak with authority? Which ones actually go back to the apostles who knew Jesus? This is not a small question. This is the question, and different communities were answering it differently. Here is something worth thinking about. If you had been born in Alexandria in the year 150, you might have grown up reading a completely different set of sacred texts than someone born in Rome in the same year. Same faith, different books. Some early Christian teachers began to push back against this diversity. They argued that the growing number of competing texts was causing confusion, division, and even dangerous misunderstandings about who Jesus was. And so a new idea began to take shape, the idea of a canon, from the Greek word meaning a ruler, a measuring stick, a standard, a list of books that could be trusted. That idea would take centuries to fully develop, but once it began, there was no turning back. Now here is where the story gets deeply interesting and where most history books either skip over the details or get them wrong. People often ask, who decided which books belong in the Bible? And they expect an answer like a council voted or one powerful man made the call. But that is not what happened. The truth is far more complicated and in many ways far more human. In the early centuries of Christianity, there was no single authority figure who controlled the whole faith. There were bishops, respected teachers, community leaders, each carrying influence, but none commanding total obedience from all Christians everywhere. Rome had authority in certain regions. Alexandria had authority in others. Antioch, Carthage, Jerusalem. Each of these centers had its own tradition, its own respected voices, and those voices disagreed, sometimes respectfully, sometimes not. So how did any book gain trust? It happened gradually, over time. A text gained authority in several ways. First, it had to be widely used. If a writing was read across many communities, in many regions, over many generations, that gave it weight. Second, it had to connect to the apostles. Books that could be traced back to Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Paul, Peter were seen as carrying the voice of someone who had actually known Jesus or known those who knew Jesus. Third, it had to teach consistently. Books that contradicted the core message of the faith, books that presented a Jesus very different from the one most communities recognized, those books raised serious questions. Here is the tension at the heart of this story. No one was formally in charge, and yet somehow a consensus began to form, slowly, over decades, over centuries, like a river finding its course, not by anyone's command, but by the accumulated weight of community after community making the same choices. Do you think a collection like this could have turned out differently? Many historians believe it absolutely could have, and that thought is worth sitting with. By the early 300s, something was shifting in the ancient world. Christianity had spent centuries being a minority religion, persecuted in waves, scattered across the empire, surviving underground and in private homes. Then came a moment that changed everything. In the year 313, the ancient Emperor Constantine issued what became known as the Edict of Milan. Suddenly, Christianity was no longer illegal in the Roman Empire, and within a few decades, it would become the dominant religion of Rome itself. Now here is where a very common misunderstanding needs to be addressed. You may have heard it said that the Council of Nicaea, in the year 325, decided which books belong in the Bible. This idea has been repeated so many times that many people accept it as fact, but it is not accurate. The Council of Nicaea in 325 was a real and historically significant event. Hundreds of bishops gathered from across the Christian world. They debated serious theological questions, particularly about the nature of Jesus and his relationship to God. These were not small questions. They were the kind of questions that had been dividing communities for generations. But the list of books in the Bible was not formally decided at Nicaea. That process was still ongoing. In fact, after Nicaea, there were still significant disagreements about certain books. The book of Revelation was contested for centuries. So was the letter to the Hebrews. So was the book of James. Different regions continued to use slightly different collections. What Nicaea did mark was a turning point, a shift toward the idea that the church needed greater unity, greater agreement, a shared foundation. And that pressure for unity did eventually push toward a more standardized list of texts, just not all at once and not at a single meeting. One of the most important moments in this process came in the year 367, when a bishop named Athanasius, writing from Alexandria, Egypt, sent a letter to the churches under his authority. In that letter, he listed the books he believed should be considered sacred. 27 books for what we now call the New Testament, the same 27 that most Christians recognize today. It was not a binding decree. It did not force anyone to comply, but it was influential. It circulated widely, it was respected, and it helped shape the conversation. And the conversation kept moving. So what was the actual process? How did a book go from being just a text to being considered sacred? Historians who have studied this question closely point to three main factors. Think of them not as a formal checklist, but as the organic criteria that communities naturally applied over time. The first was apostolic connection. Could this book be traced back to one of the original apostles, or to someone in their close circle? Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Paul, Peter, James, Jude. These names carried enormous weight. A book associated with one of them had a head start. Now, this did not mean the apostles personally wrote every word. Scholars have debated authorship questions for centuries, but the perceived connection to the apostles mattered enormously. It was about authority, about trust, about a line that could be drawn back to the source. The second factor was consistency with core teaching. A book that described Jesus in ways that contradicted the widely shared understanding of the faith raised serious questions. There were texts, for example, that presented Jesus as purely spiritual, describing him as having no real physical body. Many church leaders felt these texts misrepresented the core of the message, and those texts, however well written, faced serious resistance. The third factor was widespread acceptance. Was this book being read not just in one community, not just in one region, but across many places and across many generations? If a text had been quietly used and trusted for a long time in many different parts of the Christian world, that longevity and breadth mattered. It was a kind of informal vote carried out across decades by ordinary communities just trying to live faithfully. Here is what strikes me about this process. It was not top-down. It was not a single powerful ruler saying, you will read this, you will not read that. It was, in many ways, a bottom-up process. Communities deciding over time what resonated, what felt true, what held up. Does that change how you think about the Bible you know today? Let that sit for a moment. Now let us talk about the books that were left out, because this is the part that most people find most fascinating and most misunderstood. There is a tendency sometimes to speak of these books in a dramatic way, as if they were banned, as if powerful men gathered in secret and said, burn these, hide these, make sure no one ever reads them. The historical reality is more nuanced than that, and in many ways more interesting. Take the book of Enoch. This is a text that describes visions attributed to Enoch, an ancient figure mentioned briefly in the Hebrew Scriptures. It contains elaborate descriptions of angels, heavenly realms, and cosmic events. It was widely read. In fact, the letter of Jude, which is in the Bible today, actually quotes from the book of Enoch directly. And yet, the book of Enoch did not make it into the standard Bible used by most Western Christians. Why? Partly because many communities questioned its origins, partly because its content was difficult to reconcile with other texts, partly because it was not as widely accepted across the full breadth of the Christian world. But here is the remarkable thing. The book of Enoch was not lost. It was preserved for over 1,000 years, kept safe by the ancient church of Ethiopia, copied and recopied by hand, treated as sacred scripture. And that brings us to one of the most important points in this entire story. The idea that only one tradition got to define what was sacred is simply not true. Different communities made different choices, and some of those choices preserved texts that others set aside. The Book of Jubilees is another example, a detailed retelling of early biblical history, beloved in certain Jewish and Christian communities in the ancient world, also preserved by the Ethiopian tradition. These books were not erased, they were not destroyed, they were not forbidden by some universal decree. They simply did not gain universal acceptance. There is a big difference between those two things. What do you think? Should these books be better known today? That is a question worth asking. Here's something that surprises most Americans. Not everyone who calls themselves Christian reads the same Bible. Not because anyone is wrong, but because different traditions preserved different collections. The Catholic Bible contains 7 books that are not in most Protestant Bibles, books like Tobit, Judith, and 1st and 2nd Maccabees. These books were in wide use among ancient Jewish communities. They were part of the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures, known as the Septuagint, and they were used by early Christians for centuries. When the Protestant Reformation came in the 1500s, reformers decided to align the Old Testament more closely with the Hebrew Jewish canon, and those 7 books were set aside, not destroyed, not forbidden, but no longer included in most Protestant editions. Different choice, different tradition, different Bible. And then there is the Ethiopian Bible, which is the oldest Christian Bible in continuous use in the world. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church traces its roots to the very earliest centuries of Christianity, and their Bible contains around 81 books compared to the 66 books in most Protestant Bibles. 81, including the Book of Enoch, including the Book of Jubilees, including several other texts not found in Western collections. This is not a fringe tradition. This is one of the oldest continuous Christian communities on earth, and they made different choices because they had different texts available to them, different teachers, different history. The Bible as you know it today reflects the specific tradition you inherited, which is itself a reflection of a long, complex, and deeply human process of communities deciding what they believed, generation after generation. So let us return to the question we started with. Who decided what books belong in the Bible? After all of this, after centuries of history, after councils and bishops and communities and debates, here's the honest answer. There was no single person, no single moment, no secret meeting where a handful of powerful men decided the fate of humanity's most sacred text. The process was slower than that, and more human than that. It was communities scattered across the ancient world, each trying to understand something profound, each trusting certain voices over others, each preserving what they believed was true over generations. The books that gained the widest acceptance, that were used most consistently, that connected most clearly to the apostolic tradition, those books eventually formed the core of what we call the Bible today. But that process was not clean, it was not simple, it was not without disagreement. Books that some communities loved were set aside by others. Books that some traditions treasure still are unknown to most Western readers. And here is perhaps the most important thought to carry away from this story. The Bible was not produced in a vacuum. It was produced by human beings working within their specific times, their specific places, their specific understanding, all doing their best to preserve something they believed was worth preserving. That does not make the Bible less significant. If anything, for many people, knowing this history makes it more significant because it reveals something remarkable. That across centuries, across cultures, across languages and empires and catastrophes, something survived, something was kept, something was passed down generation to you and to me. Here is a question to leave you with. After everything you just heard, does knowing that human hands were part of this story make it feel more distant to you or somehow closer? That is not a question with a simple answer, and it is not meant to have one. If this story opens something up for you, there is much more to explore. The next video in this series goes even deeper into specific texts that were nearly included and what happened to the communities that continued to read them. Take your time with what you heard today. History rarely moves in straight lines, and the most important stories are almost always the ones no one told you in school. Thank you for watching and for thinking. That matters more than most people realize.